Welcome to Exhuming the Truth. This podcast is dedicated to cold cases, missing persons, systemic injustices, and the art of forensic science that seeks answers when silence remains. My name is Asha Carmody, and I am a forensic scientist and a criminologist, and in each episode we examine the evidence, the systems, and the human stories that are often left behind. Hello everybody, and let's get right into it. As always with my video episodes, I actually have my notes here as well because this is a new story that we're kind of going over and I want to make sure I get it right. I know people are dying for a second episode in the Strongsville crash. Now, if you are listening to this by audio only, that is the podcast edition. We do have a video option happening right now, and that is one of the biggest issues people were having. They didn't realize that you can watch by video and you can listen to the audio only. So make sure if you want to watch me waffle on, you're clicking on the video episode, not just the audio. Now, the Strongsville Crash episode 2 is coming, but I am waiting on one other document, and the reason that's taking so long is that here in Australia you can't actually access these court documents unless you're in the USA. So I'm waiting for a friend of mine who lives in America to send that document over so I can complete my analysis, basically. So today we're going to be doing a story that is American. This is an American situation in Ohio, and it's kind of just breaking as we speak. It's a couple of days old since I've kind of first seen it in the news, and I wanted to talk about it because it's got so many layers, and I think it'd be really important to follow this one along throughout the process and the trial that will be impending. So we are talking about the 16 Ohio children who were essentially rescued from their own home. Now, the youngest was 8 months old. The oldest was 18 years old. None of these children had ever been enrolled in school. None of them had a doctor on record, and some of them could barely even speak. How sad is that? And actually, one of the investigators described them as quote unquote almost feral, which is just, it's so heartbreaking. And I was talking to my husband about it last night, and he actually hadn't heard of it. He didn't read it online or anything, and I was filling him in, and he was just as shocked as I am, which is rare because usually he's like, well, you know, this happens a lot. But this kind of case it's just absolutely insane. And the amount of children. So for 4 years, right, they lived in a room, a single room, all 16 of these children. And this was a 12 by 12 foot room, which I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, is around 3-ish meters. 3 by 3, which is very small. And this was inside their home in Ohio in a village that had only 700 people, and it was in the southeast of Ohio, and nobody came to visit them, I'm suspecting, because otherwise they would have reported this, right? But people didn't show up there, or the investigators didn't show up there for the children. They actually didn't know that this was going on. So we'll get into that too, because it's very, very interesting. And this is a really disturbing child welfare story, and actually probably one of the most prominent in American history. So we're going to call this, or the adults in this situation, the Siders family, because they all had the Siders surname, and I'll get into the who's who in a moment. Now, this was in Hamden, Vinton County in Ohio. I might have pronounced that wrong, probably have. But so the 4 adults, now they were all incarcerated or held at a prison or jail. I don't know which one it is actually in America where they get held and then they go, because it's a bit more straightforward here in Australia. But anyway, they were held on a $300,000 bond per adult. And a community is asking the question that always follows cases like this, and it's how did nobody know? And we do have to look at the other family members related to these adults, like how did nobody know that this was going on? So the full timeline of what happened and what was found and what we know about the people involved is what we're going to go through. Then we're going to break down that $300,000 bond and how they came to that figure and what that actually means legally. And third of all, we're going to ask the big question, especially for me as a victim's advocate, that I cannot stop thinking about is the systemic failures in this case. How does a family of 20 people with 4 adults and 16 children disappear inside a working community for this long, for so many years? Like, how does this happen in this day and age? There's no easy answers. This is not an easy story to cover or talk about. So please be gentle with yourself when you are consuming this news and this information, because it's really, really heavy. So let's start with the timeline and how it all began. Tuesday, July the 1st, 2026. Now, Vinton County Sheriff's deputies roll up to this address on Omer Street in Hamden, which is a tiny village. Like I said, it's southeastern Ohio and the population is around 700, so it's quite small. And they're there to actually serve a warrant. They weren't there for the children to begin with. So they had no idea, actually, of the child abuse. Now, they were serving this warrant in what authorities are calling a parallel case, so it's unrelated and it's separate to the children, which they found out about when they came to serve the warrant. And basically, the reports indicate that one component was a warrant for Gary Siders Jr., and these were on charges of indecent exposure on 4 separate occasions in May of 2026. And this was allegedly in public view of people outside the household. Now, this is completely incidental, right? Because we have this horrible situation unfolding in this house. We have the police who have rolled up to serve these warrants, and they have just walked straight into something that they could never have expected. The deputies aren't there to look for the kids. They're there, for this warrant, not on a welfare tip. And this is quite routine for them. They serve warrants quite often. And in this case, instead, they've actually just walked into something that, by all accounts, none of them were prepared for whatsoever. And an Ohio Attorney General by the name of Andy Wilson, who did attend the scene, described it this way. And I'm quoting directly here. He said, "I have never seen anything like what I saw today. It really looked third world. It is not something we are used to seeing in America. I cannot get the smell off of me." How sad is that, to think that there are children living in those conditions where an adult is coming away like so traumatized from being there that this is how they're describing the scene. And that man is the state's chief law enforcement officer. Keep that in mind too. And a man who has seen his fair share in crime scenes, and a man with a career built on navigating really difficult evidence, and he can't get the smell off him. Can you just imagine the state that these children are living in? It honestly makes me feel sick to my stomach. And that detail, the smell, is not incidental from a forensic perspective. They're not being dramatic here. What investigators are describing at that scene is not just piles of trash and debris and just rubbish. It's actually human feces, because these children have been living in this room, obviously locked in there and unable to escape. They're having to go to the toilet somewhere, and it's in there. There's 16 humans in there. Just imagine. This then actually becomes a biohazard contamination in such a confined space and so many people, and the extended period of time that they're locked in this room. So we're talking about an environment that creates disease. It can create respiratory issues in that sense as well with the chemicals. It can also give the children skin conditions, parasite exposure, like you name it. All of these things, these are just rolling off my tongue. If you really sit there and think about it, there's so many health hazards here. Now, the smell he couldn't shake was the physical reality that these children were living in for 4 years in a 12-foot by 12-foot room. Just picture it. Honestly, it makes me sick. I want to make sure everyone is sitting with that and that size, the 12-foot by 12-foot. A standard master bedroom, not a wing of a house, a bedroom with 16 children in there. Like, that is crazy to me, ranging from 8 months old to 18 years old. I just cannot. Now let's talk about the 4 adults in this situation, and they're all being charged and accused, right? So who are these people? And here's what we know as of this recording right now. News is obviously updating and changing very rapidly. So this is the information that as fact-checked from this time. So we have Gary Siders Sr., okay, and he's 73 years old. He's described as kind of the patriarch of this family. and he's married to a woman named Christina, and those two are the grandparents of all 16 of these children. Then we have Christina Siders. She's 66 years old. And as I said, that's Gary Sr.'s wife. Then we have Gary Siders Jr., who was the one who they were there for on the warrant, and he's 36 years old. And he is listed as the biological father of the 16 children. And then, of course, we have the mother. This is Elizabeth Siders. She's 33 years old and listed as the biological mother of all 16 children. So all 4 of these adults are facing multiple counts of child endangerment under Ohio law, and each of those charges carries a minimum sentence of 2 to 8 years with a maximum of 12 years per count. Now, with 16 counts each, the potential maximum sentencing exposure for each of these adults runs up to 192 years. That's, of course, the maximum. So how realistic is it to imagine they're all going to get the maximum? Not very. Should they be getting the maximum? Absolutely. Now, this is a multi-generational structure, and that's really critical to understand the circumstances around that, because you've got 2 generations of adults here, and they're living under the same roof. And what that tells me as a criminologist is what the research consistently shows in cases of family system abuse. And that's that you're not looking at one bad actor here who everyone else failed to stop. We're actually looking at what one psychologist who commented publicly on this case described as a family where abuse was the family dynamic itself. And it becomes normalized. All 4 adults are in on this, and all 4 of them are living with this, and it becomes the operating system of this entire household. They are all very much implicated in this. I want to pause for a second here and say something really important, because this is a platform grounded in truth and in ethical responsibility. Now, the presumption of innocence, of course, is not just a legal technicality. It's actually a principle that matters even in cases as disturbing as this one. So these people, are entitled to the presumption of innocence. The senior Gary, his lawyer is Dorian, and Dorian came out and actually said, and I quote, "Whatever you may think you know or whatever you may have heard, there is certainly only one side of the story. It's only the story that's been released by the state." So he's kind of implying that there's more to this story. I honestly can't imagine any version of this story where any of this would be acceptable. But, we will wait. We will see this before the court and hear the facts. And he is right that the full story hasn't been heard yet. But in saying that, I honestly think it gets worse. When we do hear more, I think it's only going to get worse. And what we can say is this, that the evidence described so far by law enforcement themselves is very extensive. And the children are very much real, and the conditions are real and documented, and 16 were found in a state that the highest law enforcement officer in Ohio called almost feral. So I think any extra details that are coming are only going to strengthen that case. They are, again, of course, entitled to the presumption of innocence. We can hold both things, like, that legal principle and the reality of what the children experienced, but it's a rocky road. And from a forensic standpoint, the evidence is physical, it's also environmental, and then again, another layer is it's very biological. And the room itself becomes evidence. Then the children and their own bodies, their developmental state, like the fact that some of them couldn't talk, their nutritional evidence, have they been eating? Yes, no, the condition of these children. This is not a case that rests on testimony alone. It's very evidence heavy in the forensic sense. And that forensic picture from what has been described publicly is very, very extensive. And again, I'm of the firm belief that that is only going to get heavier with more evidence. Now, let's talk about the children. Because this does involve minors, we cannot and will not name the minors for their own protection. But let's talk about the children, because it's easy in cases like this to kind of let the legal mechanics take over, which is like the charges, the bonds, and, the adults involved. But the children are the ones who have endured this. Let's not forget that. Now, according to the court records on this case, these are the ages of the children: 18, 16, 15, 14, 13, 11, 10, 10, 8, 6, 5, and 4 sets of multiples. So there was twins at age 4 and twins at age 2, and then also twins at 18 months. And the youngest set of 3 were born within this living situation. Now, none of them have ever been enrolled in school, not one of them. The Vinton County School District confirmed there is not a single record of any of these children ever attending school. That includes the 18-year-old. So the investigators noted that the children have extreme difficulty communicating. Sheriff Ryan Kane said, and I quote, they can communicate, but it is extremely limited, and some, not all. So 7 of the 16 children were actually hospitalized in the Columbus area upon being rescued, and 2 of them were so severely affected that they were actually airlifted to trauma centers because they were so unwell. Now, the communication deficits of these children are deeply concerning, obviously, from a developmental standpoint. Children develop language through interaction. They learn from each other, they learn from their mum and dad, they learn at school, and they learn from being spoken to. Now, this isolation in a confined environment doesn't just delay language itself, it's actually altering the neutral architecture of language acquisition and how we pick things up, the way that we learn. And we're looking at children who will require extensive, very much long-term therapy and educational intervention. And they have been pushed so far back that this is going to affect them for life. Let's be totally honest. It's not something that's going to be fixed after 6 months. It's not something that's going to be fixed in foster care. Now, I need to name something here that is deeply painful, and it has emerged in reporting in the last couple of days. And in 2022, Elizabeth Siders, so that is the biological mother, she gave birth to conjoined twins. Their names, which we are able to say, were Bailey Lee Siders and Faith Lee Siders. And they actually died 1 hour after birth, and they were born into this situation and, of course, in turn died in this situation. Now, I say their names because they deserve to be named, Bailey and Faith, and I want to acknowledge something that I think sits underneath this entire case, and that is the question of Elizabeth Siders herself. This is the biological mother. She was married at 15 years old in West Virginia with a court-approved license, and that was to, of course, Gary Siders, Jr., let me add. And he was 18 at the time, and she had completed 8th grade, and he had completed 9th grade. And their first child was born 2 months after the wedding. That is not a footnote, you guys. That's a foundational fact of this case. And it raises serious questions about Elizabeth and her own history of harm, and whether she too could be a victim of this system and this family structure, because she was very, very young when she entered into this marriage and into motherhood. It's also being reported right now that Elizabeth is currently pregnant as she sits in a cell, which is also absolutely crazy. Now, criminology doesn't let us ignore the fact that this could be multidimensional. There could be a layer of abuse happening to Elizabeth as well. There very well might not be, but it's important not to shut that possibility out. Now, we know from decades upon decades of research into dynamics like this, children who are themselves abused and isolated and married into controlled family systems often just fall back into that pattern or that cycle of harm. And not out of malice, I might add, but just because it's the only kind of world that they've known, so they just happen to fall back into that. So that could be the case with Elizabeth. We really don't know just yet, but her attorney actually filed a bond modification request, noting that she wants to be reunited with her children but can't afford that $300,000 bond. So we're going to talk about the bond in depth in a moment. But first I wanted to address the question that everybody's asking, and that's, how did nobody know that this was going on? So this is a small town, around 700 people. Is it even a town? Like, it's kind of described a lot as a village and not a city, you know, a village where people know their neighbors. And I think that almost makes it worse, that it's kind of gone on in plain sight when most of the people know each other here. Like, what is going on? So this is essentially a family of 20. So we've got the 4 adults, 16 children, all living together in this one place. Obviously, the four adults are, at least in rooms together, like the older couple and the younger couple. They've just shoved the kids in one room. The water bill actually is in Christina Sider's name, so that's the grandmother. The property taxes were paid, and that was reported as of February 2026, they were paid. And for approximately 4 years, investigators estimate that actually nobody came to that house, so no visitors for 4 years. And this is absolutely insane to me, because how is this happening? Are there not other family members? Does Elizabeth not have other family members? The first kind of thing that I thought when I saw this case was like, did these kids not go to school? And that's another huge one, because education's not a choice, like it's mandatory. Kids need an education, and every state has these compulsory education laws. And Ohio has that law. They require children between 6 and 18 to attend school. And none of these kids attended school. Not even the 18-year-old, which is absolutely insane to me. The next thing is healthcare. Like, none of these kids had medical treatment or medical care or had a regular family doctor or anything like that. Like, no developmental screenings. Like, I know as a mum, when you have a baby, like they go in for their checkups and they go in for their immunizations, and like you have a regular doctor. Like, this is crazy to me. There's no records of any healthcare, no appointments, no, they've checked kind of through that avenue and nothing. And it makes it so alarming, because we know from reporting that Gary Siders, the grandfather, and Christina Siders, the grandmother, they were receiving state benefits at the time of their arrest, and they were on the system. And there was a financial relationship between this household and the state agencies and organizations. Somebody was cutting those checks and somebody was processing those applications, and at no point did anyone from any agency make a home visit that revealed what was inside. Now, I think I can confidently conclude with a lot of support that this is a structural failure of the highest order. It does not get worse than this. And I want to be clear that I'm not calling, for a witch hunt of individual caseworkers or anything like that. The systems that are supposed to catch this are chronically underfunded, they're understaffed, and they're under-resourced. And we routinely ask caseworkers to manage caseloads that are 3 and 4 times what is actually manageable or doable. And what happened in Hamden is not one person's failure. It's a system that was set up to fail the most vulnerable. And I want to say, with saying that, yes, these 4 adults are responsible for what's happened to these children. It is not necessarily the system's fault what they did to those children, but could there have been appropriate intervention or visits to that property to check on the welfare? Yes. And again, that's going to come out when more details become available, like, was Gary Jr. or Elizabeth known to government agencies? Were any of the children known to government agencies? All these types of things, because I believe, surely, if the government were aware of any of these children's existence, they surely would have had like routine contact, being like, your child is eligible for this, or they should be enrolled at school and they're not. But it seems to me that these children have just been born and then discarded, and I would be shocked to know that any of them had a birth certificate, to be honest. And I've spent many years working with victims of crime and victims of systemic failure. And what I know personally is the communities most at risk of cases kind of like this are the same communities with the fewest resources to investigate them. So I'm talking like rural communities where the mind your own business is still considered a virtue rather than a liability. So there's 700 people in this, I suppose, village. And in the middle of that village, there's 16 kids who the rest of the world had no idea existed. And that's so sad. And it's not just a family failing, it's a collective failing in a way. Now let's talk about the $300,000 bond and what that means legally, because this is something I want to spend a little bit of time on, because the public reaction to this $300,000 figure has been varied, understandably. So we've got the Judge Rogers, and she set the bond at $300,000 for each of the 4 adults, and that means that each of them must post that amount in cash or arrange a bond through a bail bondsman, typically at 10, in order to be released while awaiting trial, right? Now, before we assess whether it's adequate, let's talk about what bond is for and why they do it. So bond is not actual punishment. It's the American legal system saying the primary purpose of this is to ensure that this defendant appears in court when we need them in court. You post money as a collateral against your own promise to show up to court. It's not meant to be a sentence before conviction, but Elizabeth Sider's attorney, like we said earlier, has already filed a bond modification notice saying that she can't afford that amount. And she remains incarcerated not because she has been convicted, but because she can't meet that amount. She can't meet that financial threshold to leave. It's hard to talk about because, like, you're in there for a reason. And, like, whether, yeah, like, you lived there knowing that your 16 children were in that room, I don't care, you know? If you can't afford that amount to bail yourself out, I honestly don't give a shit. Where's she going to go anyway? But anyway, they have different factors that contribute to the amount and, you know, come up with things like $300,000. And that includes kind of assessing the severity of the charges that they are potentially facing, their flight risk, their ties to the community, their prior criminal history, if any. We know that Gary Jr. has some because he had warrants for those. And if they pose a risk basically to the community, if they are released. And in this case, you have 16 counts of child endangering her defendant, some of the most serious felony level charges in Ohio's code. Okay, so that's why they got a big whack. You have a case where, based on the indecent exposure charges that Gary Jr. was facing, at least one defendant has been demonstrating ongoing boundary violations in the weeks before arrest. And from a risk standpoint, I think that the amount is fair. And I honestly think they shouldn't even be allowed to be bailed out. Like, this is absolutely insane. The kids couldn't bail out. They were stuck there. So why do they get to bail out, you know? I don't think that a money figure should have been put on them at all. I don't think they should have been eligible to have a bond. Gary Sr.'s attorney is pursuing a not guilty by reason of insanity plea, which again, absolutely wild to me because I don't believe there were any medical records showing this, that he suffered with any kind of ill mental health problems. But again, they all deserve to be in there. Like, do they not? The kids deserve this. Like, they deserve to know that what's happened to them is so severe that they can't be set free, you know? Just makes me so sad to think about. Now, moving along, because as of July the 8th, that same Ohio Attorney General Andy Wilson, who spoke about the smell and the state of the children, he has been appointed as one of the two special prosecutors in this case, which is great because obviously he was on the scene, and that, you know, just shows you that this is a rural town. There's not a lot of resources and it's not really built for a prosecution of this magnitude at the end of the day. That's what that's saying. Especially with 16 counts per adult. Like, this is very hefty. This is going to be a very big trial, I think. I think it's going to be a very heavy trial. But anyway, none of them have a future court appearance scheduled right now, as of when I looked this morning, but that's obviously going to change. I want to underline something though also. Social media, guys, and in cases like this, social media becomes parallel and it can be very damaging. And NBC4 has already documented and debunked several false claims in regards to this story, and we made sure that we fact check everything twice before publishing it because it can be detrimental in a way that is actually not good for the children's case. When people are spreading false information, it really doesn't help the children at all, and it can compromise the investigation. So you have to be so careful, and this is where I be the victim's advocate that I am. If you want to help those 16 children, you need to follow credible journalism, and if you don't know if you're doing that, you need to fact check what you're reading yourself. Don't share unverified content. Don't identify these children. Don't speculate about details that aren't confirmed yet. The investigators are going to do their work. These people are going to have their time in court. You are going to have those answers in front of you. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but you just need to be patient because it is for the benefit of the children. Now, I wanted to add a little forensic bit, as usual, about what the forensic evidence is telling us here. And I think the forensic dimension of this case is not being discussed enough, really, on mainstream media. Am I shocked? No, because they don't really do a great job anyway. But based on what has been publicly described, investigators are working through what is, in essence, a biologically contaminated scene. Now, this scene with the children in this room, like I identified earlier, is absolutely 1000% a biohazard. And that is because of the rubbish, the feces, the debris, all of these things that you can think about 16 kids being in one room for 4 years, and I'll leave that to your imagination. But in imagining that, you need to understand that it takes time to go through and process everything in that room. So the forensic scientists on this case have quite a job ahead of them, and this will be a very controlled evidence collection, I would imagine. They were going to have the highest PPE, and they're going to have to be very careful. What are they looking for, though, in terms of physical evidence? When conditions become this bad and this severe, that matters a lot for the charges, because the duration obviously affects the sentencing, but they'll be looking at their nutrition, and that's evidence in itself, and the children's physical state, their physical state of health, their growth markers. Are they reaching those growth markers at a certain age? Are they at the right weight for a certain age? And all of this data gets collated, and it kind of goes into a chart of the severity of the neglect that these children have faced. And they're going to look at anything that establishes the role of each defendant, of each of these 4 adults. Who was responsible for what? Who had knowledge? Each of these individual adults are going to need to be individually tied to the conditions. And the physiological evaluation piece, which has already been raised for Gary Sr., will be critical across the board. And this case is where defense teams are likely to look at capacity arguments. Are they able to, psychologically withstand trial? Of course, there's always the cases where people are claiming insanity or they don't have the mental fitness to go through the trial. There's also the dimension that hasn't actually been publicly mentioned, but I think it bears naming, which is the question of whether all 16 kids share the same parents. It's kind of been said, definitely they're all Elizabeth's kids. I'm unsure 100% if they're all Gary's kids. And this was described as a intra-family case, but said at the time of discovery that it was not known who the parents of each child were. And so they're obviously going to have to do DNA tests on the children and the parents and compare everything. I'm not going to speculate about that, but that's another layer. I always want to end with action because despair isn't a strategy. And if you've listened this far, you obviously care. And I want to give you somewhere to put that energy in regards to this case. So the first thing you can do is support organizations that work with children in foster care, specifically those coming out of severe trauma situations. Now, these 16 children will need years of therapy and support. There is child welfare advocacy organizations working in Southeast Ohio, and they can take all the help that they can get, basically. Another option is advocate for compulsory education enforcement in your community and understand how your local school district responds to non-enrollment. Another way is know your mandatory reporting obligations. So in most jurisdictions, certain professionals like teachers, nurses, doctors, social workers are legally required to report suspected child abuse. So if you are working in a similar industry and you feel that something is wrong, have a look. What's mandatory to be reported for you? Another way is to push back on the bail system conversation. Don't take sides on any particular case, but demand that your representatives engage seriously with how bail functions in practice for low-income defendants. Support accurate journalism. Credible, ethical, investigative journalism is great. Always share the reliable resources. If you're unsure, always fact check. And for professionals in fields like mine, like criminology and social work and child protection, let this case be a reason to review your own systems, not just with shame, but with honesty. Like, where are the gaps? What can we do better? How could we prevent anything like this happening near us? Yeah, it's such a sad case. It made me so sad, but we will follow it beginning to end. If anything new comes to light, I will try and keep track of it for our next episode on this case. You're more than welcome to engage in conversation here. And yeah, we don't have all the answers yet. This investigation is obviously ongoing and will be for a while. There will be hearings and motions and eventually trials. And yeah, we'll continue to follow this case. And the 16 children who were found there, whose names that we don't know, whose faces that we will not show, and whose identities we will protect because we owe them that. They deserve to have their story told with the full weight of the truth and the full weight of accountability. This has been Exhuming the Truth. Thank you so much for being here. You can follow along here on YouTube. You can follow on Facebook, Instagram, wherever you can find us, really. We appreciate you being here and have a beautiful day.